Salam and peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase, and I welcome you to part 11 of episode 6. In the last part, we stood at the heart of the master tree and looked at the tri-unity of time, space, and motion. We saw omega as the pulse of time, k as the weave of space, and v as the motion of phase patterns, all built from one underlying field. We learn to feel them as three voices of one melody, sung by phi. Today we are going to step one level deeper, down past all the branches, and place our attention on the root itself. This part is about phi, the silent root, the thing that never speaks directly, but without which nothing could speak at all. Let us begin with a strange question. If phi is the most fundamental field in the universe, why do we never directly see it? Why can we measure the ticking rates, the spatial patterns, the motions, but never point to a detector and say, here, this is phi itself? The answer hides in one of the most important ideas in all of physics. An idea so simple that it almost feels like a trick. Shift symmetry. Imagine that you are listening to a familiar song played on a piano. The melody is clear. Now picture the pianist taking the entire song and moving it up the keyboard by exactly 3 keys. Every note in the song is now higher than before, but the intervals between notes, the pattern of jumps and steps, remain the same. If you are not perfect at recognizing absolute pitch, you might not even notice the difference right away. The character of the melody, the emotional line, feels almost identical. Why? Because the music you feel lives mostly in differences between notes, not in their absolute height. The whole song can be shifted up or down, and the pattern survives. Phi behaves the same way. You can add the same constant amount to phi everywhere in the universe, at every point in space and time, and nothing observable changes. All the omegas, all the k's, all the motions, all the phenomena built from derivatives remain exactly the same. The universe does not care where the zero phi is. It cares only about how phi changes. This is global shift symmetry. It is the statement that the laws of nature are blind to an overall offset of the phase. Only relationships matter. Another way to feel this is to imagine that you are hiking in the mountains. As you climb, your body responds to slopes. You feel your legs working harder on steep ascents and relaxing on gentle paths. Now imagine that, overnight, a gigantic hand lifts the entire mountain range up by 1 kilometer, perfectly straight, without changing any of its shape. The sea level, the valleys, the peaks, everything rises together. The next day, when you hike, your muscles experience exactly the same effort in every place. The slopes and curves are unchanged. You would not know that the whole landscape had been raised. Absolute altitude has shifted, but the gradients, the derivatives of height, are the same. Your body reads slopes, not absolute height. In Holophase language, phi is like the absolute height of the mountain, and its derivatives are like the slopes and curvatures. The universe, like your legs, is tuned to the differences. Particles, waves, forces, motions, all of these respond to how phi varies, not to its raw value. A uniform change in phi everywhere is invisible, just as lifting the entire landscape leaves your experience unchanged. Think of temperature as another example. Suppose you and a friend are in 2 different rooms. In your room, it is 20 degrees. In your friend's room, it is 25. You can feel that your friend's room is warmer because there is a 5-degree difference. Now suppose someone takes every thermometer in the world and adds 10 degrees to every reading. Your room now says 30, and your friend's room says 35. But the difference is still 5. All the physical processes that depended on that difference, like heat flowing from the warmer room to the cooler room, continue exactly as before. The absolute zero on the dial has been shifted. What matters is how much warmer or colder one place is relative to another. Phi is like that invisible reference scale. You can slide the entire scale up or down, and the world does not notice. This tells us something profound. Phi itself, by itself, is not an observable quantity. You cannot build an experiment that measures absolute phi at one point. You can only measure comparisons, differences, and rates of change. That is why the alphabet of the Holophase language begins not with phi alone, but with phi and its derivatives together. The letters we actually read are omega, k, d-phi, v, and all the higher derivatives. Phi is the silent paper on which the text is written. To make this even clearer, return to the image of a woven rug. Before any pattern is woven, there is a long, undyed thread, stretched and ready. You can pull a little more thread from the spool, or wind some back, but as long as the thread is plain and unknotted, nothing interesting appears on the surface. The bare thread is like phi, with no spatial or temporal variation. Once the weaver begins to knot and interlace the thread, patterns emerge. Diamonds, flowers, lines, borders. Those patterns are like derivatives of phi. They show where the thread bends, where it repeats, where it changes from place to place. If the weaver somehow dyed the entire thread a slightly darker color after the rug was finished, but kept the pattern of knots exactly the same, the structure of the rug, the picture on it, would not change. The whole rug would simply become a little darker. Shifting phi by a constant is like dyeing the entire thread by the same amount. The code of the pattern lives in the differences. This is why we call phi the silent root. It is absolutely necessary. Without phi, there would be no derivatives, no omega, no k, no v, no tree of higher structures. But phi by itself refuses to tell us anything directly. It is like a perfectly stretched, perfectly uniform canvas. You do not stare at the whiteness and say, here is the story. The story appears only when some parts are darker and some lighter, when shapes and gradients appear. Yet the canvas is always there underneath, holding every picture. Now you might be wondering, is phi then just a mathematical trick? If we can never see it directly, is it real? Here we have to remember that almost all of modern physics is written in terms of things we never directly see. No one has ever touched the electric field. We only see what it does to charges. No one has ever grabbed space-time curvature. We only see how it bends the paths of planets and light. Phi belongs to this family. It is a real field in the sense that it is the structure that makes everything else coherent. But its reality is relational, not absolute. It exists as a web of differences and changes, not as a bare number at each point. Behind this audio journey, there is a rigorous scientific backbone. The Holophase language is not just a poetic idea for a podcast. It is built on a detailed mathematical formalism that I've been working on for many years, expressed across more than 30 scientific papers. 4 core papers, which lay out the main foundations of the Holophase framework, have been publicly deposited in Zenodo, a scientific repository, so that anyone, including the harshest critic, can examine the details. If at any point you find yourself doubting whether this audio series is grounded in serious work, you can simply go to Zenodo, search for my name, and you will find the formal papers that support these ideas. The podcast is the human translation of a much more technical language. One of the most important principles running through those papers and through this audio journey is falsifiability. A theory is not truly scientific unless it opens itself to the possibility of being wrong, and unless it tells you clearly how to check. Holophase is designed with this in mind. It does not simply claim that everything is phase in a vague, mystical way. It lays out concrete structures that must match what we observe or else the theory fails. In this part, where we speak about shift symmetry, we can already see two powerful ways the holophase framework can be tested. The first test is about invariance under global shifts. If phi is truly the silent root with shift symmetry, then every quantity that we call observable must depend only on derivatives or other combinations that erase any uniform offset. That means, in the formal equations, every measurable expression must be built from differences of phi, from spatial and temporal gradients, from loops around defects, from curvatures and mixed derivatives. There should never be a term that singles out an absolute value of phi at one point as physically meaningful. If, in some extreme regime, we discovered a phenomenon that clearly depended on the absolute level of phase rather than just its differences, the holophase picture in its current form would break. This is a very strong constraint. It severely limits the kinds of equations we are allowed to write. Any future experiment that convincingly shows sensitivity to an absolute phase zero would falsify the core assumption that phi has global shift symmetry. The second test concerns the way derivatives of phi organize themselves into a coherent atlas. One of the central claims of the holophase program is that all known physical fields and particles can be re-expressed as structured combinations of derivatives of a single phase field. This is not just a slogan. The formal papers lay out a detailed dictionary that maps traditional entities like gauge fields, curvature tensors, and topological charges into specific branches of the derivative tree of phi. That mapping implies relationships between quantities that would otherwise be independent. In principle, this gives us many sharp predictions. For example, if two phenomena that are currently treated as separate fields turn out, in holophase language, to be different components of the same derivative object, then their behaviors under change, under symmetry transformations, and under quantization must be linked in specific ways. If high-precision experiments reveal violations of those links, the holophase mapping would be disproven. Because this mapping is so tight and economical, it leaves little room for adjustment. That makes it fragile in a good way, easy to break by data, and therefore genuinely scientific. Now, let us come back from these structural tests and return to the feeling level, to phi as the silent root of your own experience. You never wake up in the morning and say, I sense the absolute phase of the universe is some number. What you sense are differences. You feel the difference between yesterday and today, between warm and cold, between stillness and movement. Your whole nervous system is a detector of derivatives. Your eyes respond to changes in light, not to a constant brightness. Your ears respond to vibrations, not to a constant pressure. Your skin responds to changes in temperature, not to an absolutely fixed value. Everywhere, your body is wired to notice slopes rather than plateaus. If, as a thought experiment, the universe suddenly froze all derivatives of phi to zero, while keeping phi itself defined, everything would go dark and silent. There would still be a value of phi at every point, but nothing would change from place to place or from moment to moment. No light would flicker, no sound would ripple, no motion would unfold. The world of experience would disappear, even though phi, in some abstract sense, would still exist. This shows you how deep the silent root really goes. Reality, as you live it, is not phi alone. It is phi in motion, phi in variation, phi in contrast. We can capture this in one last metaphor. Think of a perfectly tuned violin string stretched in absolute silence. The string is real. It has tension and length and potential. But if it never vibrates, you hear nothing. Phi is that silent, stretched string. Its derivatives are the vibrations, the standing waves, the harmonics, the melodies. You do not hear the existence of the string. You hear what it does when it is disturbed. Yet you could not remove the string and keep the music. The music needs the instrument, even though the instrument by itself is mute. There is a very down to earth example of shift symmetry that almost everyone has carried in their pocket. Think about a digital camera on a phone. When you take a photo, the sensor records brightness values for every pixel. Suppose that for some reason the electronics of the phone add the same constant value to every pixel in every image. Every photo becomes a little brighter, but the differences between bright and dark regions stay exactly the same. The contrast of the scene, the pattern of light and shadow, remains. When you look at the images, you might notice that the overall exposure is off, but the shape of faces, the lines of buildings, the letters on a sign are still perfectly recognizable because those shapes live in the pattern of differences. Phi plays the role of that underlying brightness scale. A uniform shift of phi is like cranking up the brightness slider on every pixel by the same amount. As long as you later subtract out that common offset, the information in the picture is untouched. In physics, we often treat this kind of freedom as a gauge choice. You are allowed to change your description in certain ways without changing any predictions. Imagine that everyone in the world suddenly decides to start measuring height not from sea level, but from the center of the Earth. All the numbers on maps will change, but climbing a hill will feel the same. Or imagine that all thermometers are recalibrated so that what used to be 10 degrees now reads 0, and what used to be 30 now reads 20. The labels change, the pattern does not. The Holophase view says that phi has this gauge freedom built into its core. Any absolute value you assign is partly a choice of description. Only gauge invariant combinations, like derivatives and loops of phase around defects, represent physical facts. If you are an audio listener who does not care about equations, you can translate all of this into one sentence. Phi is the part of reality that can be changed everywhere by the same amount without anyone noticing. It is the silent background. Everything you can notice lives in how it bends, twists, and varies. When we speak of the master tree, with phi at the root and its derivatives rising above, we are really saying that the visible universe is the tree and phi is the soil from which the tree grows. You might ask, why even introduce phi if it is so shy? Why not start directly from omega and k, the derivatives that we can, at least in principle, measure? The reason is that derivatives by themselves do not tell a full story. A slope only makes sense as the derivative of something. When you say, this hill has a slope of 10 degrees, you are implicitly referring to an underlying height function, even if you never write it down. In the same way, omega and k are not free-floating objects. They are tied together by the fact that they come from one underlying phase. This unity is what allows the holophase framework to lock time, space, and motion together so tightly. By postulating the single phi underneath, we explain why the derivatives are not independent, why they obey certain consistency conditions, why the tree has the shape it does. Let us look at your own life through this lens for a moment. There are many aspects of you that can be shifted without changing who you are. If you learn a new language and start thinking in different words, your core character may remain. If you move from one country to another, adopting a new calendar or a new currency, the numbers describing your days change, but the pattern of your relationships, your fears and hopes, your sense of humor can remain recognizably the same. We might say that the absolute labels have shifted while the internal structure stays. Something like phi lives under your personal story as well. A silent continuity that is not directly visible in any single fact, but shows up as the way all your changes hang together. The holophase story does not claim that this personal phi is literally the same object as the physical phase field, but it invites you to feel the rhyme. At many levels, what truly matters is relational pattern, not absolute labeling. Here is another way to meet phi in daily life. Imagine you are in a dark room with a friend, and both of you are holding identical flashlights. You agree on a simple game. First, you both turn your lights to the same brightness. and you shine them on opposite walls. The room is dim but calm. Then your friend slowly turns their light brighter and dimmer while you keep yours fixed. Even without seeing the absolute output of either lamp, you can tell when their brightness is increasing or decreasing relative to yours. You are sensing a derivative, a change, not an absolute intensity. Now, suppose someone secretly installs a filter in front of both lamps that absorbs the same fraction of light from each. The whole room becomes darker, but the way your friend's beam fluctuates relative to yours is unchanged. That hidden filter is like a shift of phi. The language of bright and dim, the dance of differences, keeps its meaning. When physicists talk about fields, they are often tempted to reify them, to imagine them as invisible substances filling space. The holophase approach resists this temptation. Phi is not a ghostly fluid, but a bookkeeping device for relations. It is more like the phase of a complex number in mathematics, or the angle of a hand on a clock, than like a gas or a liquid. Its value at one point has almost no meaning by itself. Its value at one point compared to another point, or at one time compared to another time, is where the physics enters. That is why the formalism is written almost entirely in terms of derivatives, gradients, curls, divergences, and closed loops of phase. Those are the places where shift symmetry cancels out and genuine content remains. If you could see the universe through holophase glasses, phi would not appear as a static color painted onto space. Instead, you would see an endless field of arrows showing how phase changes when you nudge in different directions. At each point, small vectors would indicate omega in the time direction and k in the different spatial directions. Curvatures would show where these vectors twist and fold. Defects would stand out as places around which phase winds by a whole turn when you make a loop. The absolute phase at any one point would never be drawn. It would be like a hidden origin that can slide around without altering the picture. You would be inhabiting a world of differences only, and yet that world would be enough to reconstruct everything you now call reality. This perspective can even change how you think about unity and conflict between different physical theories. Many of the great tensions in modern physics come from trying to reconcile frameworks that treat their basic quantities as absolute. Holophase suggests a different angle. It says, start from what is invariant under shifts, under gauge changes, under relabelings, and build everything from there. Phi provides a single phase from which many existing structures emerge as different ways of taking derivatives and then packaging those derivatives into objects that respect the symmetries. From this point of view, the apparent patchwork of theories may be a sign that we have been focusing on the wrong level, just as arguing about cliff heights makes little sense if we forget that the important thing for a falling stone is the slope and the local curvature. There is also a subtle but important psychological effect of learning to focus on derivatives rather than absolutes. In everyday life, we often get stuck on absolute judgments. I am not good enough. I am too far behind. My situation is fixed. The language of derivatives reminds us to ask different questions. In which direction am I changing? Is my slope upward or downward? How is my internal phi varying from day to day? You can change your relationship to your own story by thinking more like physics does, caring less about where you happen to be on some arbitrary scale and more about the pattern of change. In that sense, phi and its shift symmetry become not just a technical concept, but a small spiritual teaching about what truly matters. For our purposes in this episode, however, the main message is sharply focused. Phi is the root of the master tree, and shift symmetry is the rule that blinds the universe to any uniform offset in that root. All observables must be written in terms of how phi changes, never in terms of its naked value. The entire holophase architecture is built to respect that rule. If future data ever forces us to abandon shift symmetry, the theory will have to be revised or replaced. That vulnerability is a feature, not a bug. It means we are not hiding behind vagueness. We are betting on a clear structure, a silent root, an infinite derivative tree, and a universe that cares only about the branching patterns of change. Before we move on, let us pause and compress the core intuition into a single portable image. Phi is like a universal reference tone that plays everywhere, all the time, but that no ear can hear directly. Shift symmetry means you can slide that tone up or down together, and nothing in the harmony of the world will change. What you actually hear, what you see and touch and measure, are the intervals, the beats, the modulations that ride on top of that silent note. Those are the derivatives. They are the alphabet of experience. As you listen to the later parts of this episode, when we talk about omega, about k, about the unified change called d-phi, and about the motion encoded in v, keep remembering the lesson of this part. Under every letter of the language, there is a blank page. Under every melody, there is a silent key. Under every slope, there is a hidden height function. Under the endless branching of the master tree, there is a single invisible root. That root is phi, and its shift symmetry is the quiet rule that lets the rest of the structure exist without ever pointing at itself. As we close this part, keep the image of the master tree in front of your mind. At the root lies phi, glowing faintly, not because it broadcasts anything by itself, but because it supports the entire structure above it. From this root, all the branches of time, space, motion, curvature, topology, energy, and beyond emerge. Phi does not shout, it whispers. Its whisper is heard only through the differences that climb the tree. Our journey through this episode is a journey from that silence into the full language of variation. In the next part, we will move from the quiet root to the first clear beat. We will focus on omega, the temporal echo of phi, and explore how the simple idea of a local ticking rate can grow into the rich experience we call time. But as we do so, remember the lesson of this part. Beneath every clock, beneath every rhythm, beneath every story of before and after, there is a field whose absolute level you can never see, only its changes. That field is phi, the silent root of the holophase language.